Well, you get me tonight on the book of Daniel. Let me start off by saying I don't know much about the book of Daniel. I'm seminary educated, and John was up here teaching on the book of Daniel, and I realized I don't know that much about Daniel. In 10 years as your pastor, I can't recall that I ever preached from Daniel. And I appreciate John's efforts. This is a part of the gift of Wednesday night. We've been gifted this whole canon of Scripture, and yet we have figured out just in our normal rhythms that some parts of that aren't relevant to us, and we don't ever touch them. And I appreciate John recognizing that all of the Scriptures are a gift. All of them have something to say to us, and we need to get to the things that are difficult and challenging and the texts that are hard. This one is just ignored mostly because it is just so bizarre. You've got all this apocalyptic stuff going on, and you start reading, I'll look at it'll show up in the lectionary sometimes, and I'll look at it and say, no, I'm going to go with Matthew this time. It's just, so I really appreciate that he is taking these weeks for us to dig in. But I told Melissa, I said, if I were subbing for him tonight on like the parables, I'd have a little overflow. I could have come up here and talked about the parables for 45 minutes, and I had to work. I had to study, and what I don't know about Daniel, you can't imagine. But what I have learned about Daniel is not only is it probably the most unusual book of the Old Testament, it's the only apocalyptic literature in all of the Old Testament. But it is also full, part of what makes it hard to study or preach from is that it's got all kinds of textual and literary complications. They're problems inside of it that are hard to figure out. We're going to look at one of those tonight where one of the images just shifts right in the middle. And it's like, how did that happen? For instance, let's go to I've got this. Wait a minute. I'm the one not clicking. You see, I pointed it at that like that's going to help. Can you click me over? Because I'm apparently not doing this well. Let's click again. We'll click again. We'll click again. Let's go one more. There we go. So, and I don't have this screen on, if we can help me here. But you see on this illustration, this bottom part that's Aramaic. One of the textual problems going on in this book is it even shifts language. It's in Hebrew. All of the chapters are in Hebrew, and then it just stops and goes to Aramaic for a couple of chapters, and then it goes back to Hebrew. And it doesn't shift in natural places. It doesn't shift like in a unit. Like you would think that the parts in Aramaic would be a self-contained unit that would make sense on its own. It doesn't. So here's another textual problem before we get into it. Tonight, and I know y'all know we're looking at chapters 4 and 5, and I know all of you have already read chapters 4 and 5, and y'all are ready with your questions. I just need to get through some of this. So you already know that chapter 4 is the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 is the story of the king Belshazzar. And the scriptures say that Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, which is normal. Except that is a textual problem too, because that doesn't correspond to anything in the other records of ancient history. Instead, Belshazzar appears to be the eldest son of Nabonidus. Nitocris was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, it appears to be his grandson, not his son. And it appears that he never actually had the throne. He served as an interim at a time when his dad, the king, was away. So it's just full of textual problems that make it really hard to teach and preach from. We have been looking, thank you, that's the slide I need right now. Part of what this study has been highlighting that I didn't know were the parallel chapters throughout the book, right? John has shown us how chapter 2 has a parallel chapter with 7 because chapter 2 is about the king's dream, 7 is about Daniel's dream. They mirror each other, and they kind of move from the outside in. You've got these 2 and 7, 3 and 6, right, with these parallel chapters. You've got this fiery furnace, a place of tragedy where people could lose their lives and don't, and a parallel in chapter 6 of the lion's den, which should have gone to the loss of life and doesn't. And tonight we've got a parallel between 2 king stories. We've got King Nebuchadnezzar's pride, Belshazzar's pride. They're 2 different king stories and 2 different visions that need interpreting, and we're going to jump into that in just a minute. But that's one way to look at the structure of the text, or these parallels. But the other way to look at it is to think about the first half of the book being one kind of literature and the second half of the book being a different kind of literature. So chapters 1 through 6 are all court stories. That is, they happen in the palace, in the king's court. The setting for all of these is the king saying, "Hey, come here, I've got a..." And we've got other examples of this in biblical literature, in Esther, in Genesis, Joseph. A lot of the Joseph stories are court stories. It's interactions with the palace and so forth. And then there's a literature shift in chapter 7 that goes to apocalyptic visions. So the second half, which is why next week, now this has been included, 7 is included in this structure, but if you notice, John is going to teach all of 8 through 12 next week as one unit of literature, because 8 through 12 is all apocalyptic, and he's going to just talk about that as one body of work. The occasion for this, like so much of the Old Testament literature, is it's a word of hope to a marginalized group who are political subjects. Right? So the Jews under Babylonian captivity are minorities. They're badly treated. They don't have much existential hope. And so a lot of the Old Testament literature is designed to bolster and give them hope as a minority people. And this a part of the thread that's through all of these stories are you've got these lowly Jewish exiles who are standing firm in their faith in the face of the empire, right? The Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego into the furnace, right? You've got these lowly folks and the king's decree, but still the faith of the Jewish people hold when people hold to their faith, they end up victorious. So it's that kind of hopeful imagery and literature throughout. So let me get to the text itself, and we'll look at chapter 4 and then chapter 5. I'm going to pull stuff to write on over here, and you all start by telling me, because all of you read chapter 4 and 5 and came with questions, what questions, insights, hopes you have for understanding 4 and 5 tonight. Uh-oh. Yeah, that's good. That's right. Can you all see this if I stay here? Is this good? Bring my notes. You want me to just call on you? Is that? No. I may or may not write stuff. Let me outline chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts with Nebuchadnezzar. This is about Nebuchadnezzar's pride. And he starts in the chapter confessing the God, the Most High God, right? It's been the prophet's declaration throughout that it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Most High God that is only worthy of worship. And you remember in earlier chapters there have been flip-flops where Nebuchadnezzar would worship Daniel's God and then he'd go back to doing, well, he starts off in chapter 4 confessional. He's confessing the Most High God in the first 3 verses. But then in verses 4 through 9, he calls his counselors together. This is a repeated theme. Remember in chapter 2 he did this too. Calls the counselors together to find out about his dream. He's living at home. He had a dream. He's become terrified by it. So he calls in the folks of the court to help him understand it. He calls in magicians. That word has origins in Egypt. Enchanters have origins of Persia. Chaldeans or astrologers, diviners, exorcists. Part of what's trying to be communicated here in the literature is that it is from all of these kind of worshiping communities that worship and see and divine in all of these different ways. And yet none of them. So it wasn't like just the guy he had on staff to do dreams wasn't getting it that day. They're trying to communicate that nobody in the whole larger land could do this. And so finally, Daniel is called upon again. And in this, Nebuchadnezzar changes Daniel's name to Belteshazzar, which will be the last time tonight I say that. We're going to call him Daniel. But he gets his name changed. He comes in, and Nebuchadnezzar tells him his dream and waits for the explanation. And he tells him he has this dream of a tree. It's a huge tree. It touches the sky. It's visible from all ends of the earth. And in this tree, there is shelter underneath this tree for all of the creatures. There are birds that live in this tree and find their home there. This tree produces so much fruit, so much food, that all people get to be fed, and everybody has enough because of this wonderful, fabulous tree. And then in the dream, a holy messenger comes and says, cut that tree down. The tree's going to be cut down, trimmed, scattered. All of those animals are going to be scattered all over the place. But there's going to be a stump of that tree that stays. and it'll be bound in iron and bronze. But now I want you to pick up the shift in image. Remember I told you there's all kind of wacky stuff going on here? So watch this. We're in 10 through 18, so let me catch it. So 10 starts, I saw this tree at the center of the earth. That goes through 12. Then the Holy Watcher comes in 13. The animals flee and are scattered in 15. And then, verse 16, let his mind be changed from that of a human and the mind of an animal given to him, and let 7 times pass over him. Somehow the image shifted from a tree to a beast with no warning. It just went from tree to beast. And now we've got a whole different image playing out where the beast is now kind of in exile. Let 7 times pass over him, usually interpreted to be for 7 years the beast is going to be out there roaming around. So we asked Daniel, you got anything to say? Could you tell me what this means? In 19 to 27, Daniel interprets, you are the tree. You are great. And everybody's getting provision because you are the tree. And the birds have a place to rest, and the beasts have a place to come and get shade, and everybody's being fed. You are so great. You are the tree. But, verse 25, you are also the beast. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the wild animals. You'll be made to eat grass like oxen. You'll be bathed with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you until you've learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whom he will. So, he speaks a hard word to Nebuchadnezzar, but he does it with a kind of suitable apology. I don't know if you're reading along and caught any of that, but he said, I'm going to interpret this for you, but I really wish I was interpreting it for your enemies and that it had to do with them and not you. I mean, he's kind of being nice about it. But you asked, and so, okay, there's been enough of this, and it's going to be bad. And verse 28 through 33, the dream is fulfilled. What he anticipates 1 year later actually happens. And Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy. There's a snap. There's a mental insanity that happens for him, and he is living out like it was projected. He's living out with the animals, and as the symbols said, his hair grows long like the the wings of the, what was it? Yeah, his hair grows long like the eagle's feathers, and his fingernails grow long like the talons of the what. So he's just, it's a mess, right? For 7 years he's in this mess. But then, verses 34 through 37, his sanity is restored. And when it is, he confesses what is a central verse in all of the Daniel literature. The close of this part of the story with Nebuchadnezzar, he says in verse 37, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all of his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So it was Nebuchadnezzar's pride. He was the great tree and the great provider and the great, and he was king. And he was pretty full of being king. And even that pride can be humbled by the King of heaven. And so he is restored. Then we've got, any questions about that one? Anything we want to talk about in chapter 4 before we make the shift to 5?
Is there any particular reason that it's 7 years? I mean, I think if I'm eating grass in 7 days.
That'd be enough? Yeah. I don't know, apart from, because I didn't dig in particularly there, apart from the fact that 7 is used a lot in biblical literature just to mean a lot. And so it doesn't always mean 7. It sometimes just means completion until it's completed. So the earth is created and prayed over in a 7-day, and so literally that means it was complete. And so every time there's a 7 in the text, it's a trigger to say it was complete.
So we could look at this and say his insanity was complete.
Yes.
He was completely insane.
Well, no. I think more it would be that the season of insanity came to completion.
Okay.
Right? In the way that season of creation came to completion, that kind of thing. The other biblical number for completion is 3. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And so those two numbers always trigger things. Yeah.
I think what I've always wondered about this chapter is if we're taking it on face value and not kind of pulling deeper meaning in it, it seems like he still remains king at that point. But that's a hard thing to really understand if his circumstances have changed so much. So that's what I've always wondered is why would he remain king?
Why would he remain king? Yeah. So the question is, if we take this at face value and he's lost his mind for 7 years, why does he remain king? I'm guessing, just to say, because of the nature of kingship, unless there's a military challenge, there's not a challenge. Kind of like when they said the Queen of England should step down after she got to be 90. Well, there's no challenge to that. You are until you are challenged. But the other possibility here is if 7 is taken around its symbolic value and not its literal value. And it doesn't say 7 years. It says 7, what's the language? 7 seasons. 7 periods. So it can just mean a period of insanity that came to completion, right? If we take it as symbol and not literal. But still, there was a move away from functioning as a king if he had a period of insanity before he came back to his own.
Fingernails could grow like bird's claws, and his hair could turn out like eagle's feathers. That probably took a long time.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
And while we don't know this, there is a more recent than this example of something similar happening in England in the 1700s. When King George, the whole madness of King George,
Right.
King George III
That's right. Gail was saying the same thing happened when King George lost his mind and his son became regent. He had to leave the throne. Jim? He said, this is not farm to table, this is table to farm. This is true. This is true. Well, let's look at the parallel story that's just next door to this one in chapter 5. As I said, we've got some literary historical gaps in there. But Belshazzar becomes king, and he is a much less sympathetic character than Nebuchadnezzar. It's probably the grandson, and because there are no records of him having been king, it's probably him operating as regent in his dad's absence that this interplay takes place. But he is completely arrogant. The first 4 verses of chapter 5 displays his kind of abuse of power, his flaunting of his wealth, of his power, and he's throwing these grand parties with vessels of gold and silver, parties with wives and concubines and nobles, but more to the point, this excess is taking place with the chalices of gold and silver that had been looted from the temple destruction. So it's a sacrilege. It's not just excess, it's excess and sacrilege to the Jewish people. And in the midst of all of this wild debauchery, he's having a big festival for 1,000 folks, and he's drinking wine, and they're just having a big old party. They bring the gold and silver vessels. Wait a minute. So let's go to verse 5. And while they're in this big party, the fingers of a human hand appear and start writing on the plaster of the wall in the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king's watching this hand as it's writing. The king goes pale. He's terrified. His limbs give away. His knees knock together. He cries aloud again to the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the diviners, all the wise men of Babylon, read what is on this wall and tell me what it is. This is where the phrase, the writing on the wall, comes from. Didn't you see the writing on the wall? So, he calls this crowd together again and wants to know what this is about. And this is very public. This is 1,000 people. This is the hoity-toity, and this has happened. There's writing on the wall. He summons the diviners. Tell me what it means. They can't even read it. So in verses 10 through 12, the queen's mother introduces him to Daniel. You ought to know about this guy. He's got a history at the palace. Let me tell you about him. And in 13 through 16, Daniel gets before the king, and he is much less deferential than he was to King Nebuchadnezzar. He says, so the king says in 14, I understand that you've got the spirit of the gods and enlightenment and understanding. The enchanters I brought can't do anything. If you're able, tell me the interpretation, and I'll clothe you in purple. I'll put a chain of gold around your neck and make you third in rank in the kingdom. And Daniel says, you can just keep your gifts for yourself. Just, I'll read it, but I don't care about your gifts. And so, in 17 through 23, Daniel interprets the dream. let's see. He basically says, he had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's pride and arrogance and says to Belshazzar, you're prideful and arrogant too. And I'm going to tell you what was written and what it means. And in verse 25, it says that it was written, that's the interpretation. What they wrote were 4 words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And they couldn't figure out what that meant. And he came back to tell them what the words meant. M-E-N-E, the Mene word, he interprets in verse 5 to say, God has numbered your days and your reign. T-E-K-E-L is the word for scale. And he tells him, you've been weighed on the scales and you've been found wanting. And the last word, P-A-R-S-I-N, your kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, this guy has been shown arrogant. He has shown no respect for the Jewish tradition at all. He's exploited the looting from the temple and all of that. He gets this horrible declaration from Daniel about his fate and his future. And then in verse 29, the oddest thing happens. He doesn't get mad. He hears it and then fulfills what he said he was going to do, that Daniel said he didn't care if he did it or not. He gives him the gold chain, the purple clothes, all of that, and makes him third in the kingdom's ranking. And that night he was killed. So interpret that for me. What you got?
He didn't humble himself.
Mm-mm. He didn't. And there's no professing in the way there was in Nebuchadnezzar. That's right. There wasn't I believe in your God. The last verse we read, remember, from the Nebuchadnezzar story, there's not a parallel to that in this one. What else you make of this? All right, we're going to turn to table talk for just a minute, but I want to focus on, I want to focus on 2 of the questions. You've got these questions at your table. But I want us to take a few minutes around the last 2 questions. How are these stories subversive? And what are the lessons of lasting value in the stories of the 2 kings? Give me one example of how this literature is subversive. Y'all are not through yet. So I don't even need to ask the next question, right? But we were talking about at our table that if you pull back to kind of the macro theme of the book, it is how God endures and how faithfulness endures. Kings come and go. Empires rot. They get scattered. Kings die. But the faithful make it through the fiery furnace. The faithful make it in the lion's den. The faithful come out on top. And empires and kingdoms come and go and come and go. God's reign is forever and ever and stable and always. And in that way, it is subversive literature to a people who are beat down, oppressed. Their temple was destroyed. The king's laughing at them and drinking out of their holy goblets and all of that. And it's a vision of hope for these people, that the God we worship is always going to be on top and always going to be in charge, no matter who happens to sit on the throne. And because of time, we'll let that be the final word, that is not only the subversive part, but that's the lesson of lasting value. Next week, I'm still not good at this. Oops. All right, let me just talk about it. Next week, we're going to talk about the rest of Daniel. John will be back, and he's going to do an overview of what apocalyptic literature looks like and what it looks like specifically in the book of Daniel as he takes on those last chapters 8 through 12 next week. Any final words before all of you go to choir? All right, I'll see you Sunday. Go in peace.